Hey folks, it's Mark here. We've got a really special guest on this week, but due to some COVID isolation, there was a sudden change of plan, and as a result there is some poor audio quality. So we apologise for that. We've done our best to try and fix it. Hopefully you like it. Enjoy. Hey folks, welcome to the Unsung Podcast. I am, of course, your host Mark Fraser, and I'm joined once again by Mr.
Christopher.
Yay! David is not here because he's fallen down a well, and that's really bad. Hope his ankles are okay. Get well soon, Dave.
We subbed in again. We're cashing in our saved up points that we've got from podcast land, and we hired the services of a countryman, a music aficionado, a troubadour, I think you could be described as, a moderate eccentric, a DIY pioneer. You care to introduce yourself, mystery stranger?
Yeah, my name's Kapil Seshasayee, and moderate eccentric's a good way of describing it, I suppose. I like moderate for some reason, makes it a much funnier pairing than if I was an extreme eccentric or not one at all.
I always like, Kapil's got the makings of a bit of a nut job, except he's so pleasant and reasonable. I feel like I'd always talk you down. But yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here, man. We've actually, as it happens, Kapil's doing great things with his music at the moment, turning a lot of heads. You've quite probably seen him or heard him on something. But we've actually been friends for quite a few years now, and my first introduction to Kapil was DIY promotion. You were always doing things the hard way. You're always finding bands and helping try and get things off the ground, and so that was really where we kind of bonded. So it seemed an obvious choice to ask Kapil on, if he could have the time, obviously, because you are a busy man. But yeah,
appreciate that.
So we'll keep your choice a secret. Mark, do we have any sort of like housekeeping to get out the road here?
Yeah, we do. As ever, we require your funding. With Dave away, we are a man down, and so if you are feeling flush, if you want to give a few pennies to your favourite podcasters, which we found out today we are of some people, go to unsungpod.net/donate. We've got a tip jar on PayPal there, and we've also got Patreon, which has lots of really cool tiers, and you get a lot of fun stuff, including some great bonus episodes, which we also found out today that people enjoy, which is always good to know. And the reason I say that is because subscribers, if you are listening, and you are listening to this first, because that's one of the perks you get, we have sent out a survey, both to your email addresses, both on our Patreon and on our legendary mysterious Facebook group. If you could take some time to fill that in, give us your feedback, that would be really good. We're approaching 4 years of this show, and we think it's probably time we change a few things up, and the direction can be dictated a little bit by ourselves. So if you do nothing else this week and you're a fan of ours and you give us money already, please go and fill that out. We'd appreciate it.
If you're the kind of person that does nothing else this week, you're probably bang slap in our demographic. These sort of losers that obsess over obscure music endlessly. Yep, you're on the team. That's fine.
Speaking of obsessing over obscure music endlessly, Kapil, what did you pick this week?
I picked the album Houdini by the band Long Fin Killie.
He said I'm just a little fascinated by the female form, but sadly you're as near as I'll ever get, and if I fail...
To me, it's a real lost gem, and it makes me sad how many people haven't heard of this band, so I thought I'd highlight it for that exact reason.
Well, hands up. Whilst being aware of Long Fin Killie, I hadn't heard this. I'd maybe heard it in parts over the years, but I'd never properly sat with the band in that way, so this has forced me to reckon with it, and it's been interesting. But I think before we discuss them, Kapil, because I don't want to take this for granted, we're familiar with what you are and what you've been doing. Would you mind giving the audience a wee bit of insight into yourself?
Aye, of course. I'd describe what I do as like protest music, and I guess it intersects a few different styles of music.
Another tenet of a speech I gave, only ever in a bid to play along. Well, consider it done. I desire to move on, redesign all my wants.
For a bit of context, I think our first kind of meeting, I asked if I could play a wee gig in block when I started doing my solo thing, and back then it was all me, guitar, a kind of a distorted guitar and laptop, kind of a big black industrial kind of thing I was doing. But over time it's kind of molded into intersections between like R&B and classical music, post-punk, loads of different things. But yeah, it all kind of changed when I started writing about more political causes. The big one being like, I released an album about the Indian caste system about 3 years ago. Without going too deep into that, it's like this ancient system of oppression, originally from Hinduism, that's now in Sikhism and Islam and even Indian Christianity. And it's wherever South Asians settle, you'll tend to find this kind of oppression. And you can find that it's the root cause of a lot of honour killings, forced marriages, and a lot of cultural bigotry going back hundreds and hundreds of years that's still lasting into the present day. And I did a concept album about it.
And failing that acknowledge what at best just does the atrophy.
Toured it around the place, managed to get some really cool people writing about it in Pitchfork, Vice, Rolling Stone, etc. But from there, the ambition grew into like, hey, one album's great, but why don't I do like a trilogy of albums about different causes? I reckon with my identity a lot. And my identity is not just someone in Scotland, but someone South Asian. It kind of factors into my choice of album this week as well, just because in addition to being an amazing musician, Luke Sutherland, the guy who fronted Long Fin Killie, he's also an author, and a book of his in particular, Venus as a Boy, I recommend everybody read it. It's like a reckoning of race and being Scottish, and I find that a lot of books about race and racism are written from a weirdly like London kind of centric point of view, and yeah, his body of works resonated with me in this really deep way. But going back to what I have to say, I suppose I grew from doing this one album to almost having like, hey, what if I was to reckon with an almost South Asian analog to Afrofuturism, which I call Desi-Futurism, and I'm working on this Desi-Futures trilogy of albums. The first one's out, the album's called Sacred Boar. The next album's out in February or March of next year, and it's like a concept album about Bollywood, getting away from the matching costumes and the dancing and getting more into the kind of conversations about censorship, casteism, and really hyper-nationalism that's going on in India, and how like Bollywood enables a lot of the worst facets of it. Going really long and hard on these kind of difficult conversations, but trying to frame them in a way that's going to get people to engage with them is the long and short of it. And I've been hyper lucky to be able to play my music and find more of an audience over lockdown in India and Canada and stuff. But more importantly, like in Scotland, it's nice to finally be able to find a community and an audience, and folk like, you know, you've both put me on at some point, and you know, it's much appreciated to have a platform for a message that's maybe a wee bit niche and a wee bit obscure. So no, it's lovely to be asked on, just because it's a continuation of the fact that we've played together, we've been to each other's shows over the years, because that's what DIY is about, isn't it? It's not just about you come see me, it's like, we'll come see each other, let's put each other's bands on, and it's a rare thing, like, and it's something you appreciate way more that when you consider the fact that no one's been in the same room as anybody else for 18 months, I suppose.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that stand out for what you said there. The first that I don't want to skim by is with the Desi-Futurism, man. I really, really hope you bring in the UFOs and shit the way Parliament did.
Tinfoil turbans, the lot.
Oh my God, I am sold. But yeah, I mean, as you're saying about the DIY thing, I mean, it's one thing running a venue and helping DIY promoters, but also that's the way DIY works. The venues wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the promoters. So it's as reciprocal a relationship as I think you'll find in music. You know, it's really not a top-down thing at all, and I don't know many people that run those kind of venues that even see it that way. It's like, it feels sometimes that everybody that's performing is doing certainly as much of a favour for us as the venue as it does vice versa. So I think that's something nice about it. And as you say, you started in a certain place for your music, and I always really enjoyed all these little directions you went, and kind of watching it happen in real time as well, watching you kind of go down certain paths, and some you were like, right, oof, that's pretty intense, that's pretty
Yeah,
like
trying different hats on until I settled on the beanie.
Experimental. I've seen you doing some really avant-garde stuff at times. And as you say, I've seen you doing the kind of big black stuff that landed you on bills with a different kind of group, and then you kind of moved on again.
Yeah.
Started doing this slightly higher production stuff, which has landed you on different bills. And like, I've loved watching that happen in real time. And also, I guess there's just a kind of selfish pride of like watching one of our own, watching one of the DIY scene do things on his own terms. And that's just incredibly rewarding. You know, so like,
I mean, that means a whole lot, because if I'm honest, that sense of belonging and community is a really important thing. And again, like, as I recommend everyone check out that book, Venus as a Boy, I think you can realize that as it relates to stuff like race is that you grew up in a community where you don't look like anybody, and you can feel a wee bit, not just like an outcast, that nothing you do can help you belong. But I've been quite lucky in that I've always felt a real big part of the Glasgow DIY scene, and folk like yourself and stuff saying stuff like that, it means a whole lot, because you realise that if you're going to because how many times has anybody seen that, oh, this person like played a gig and is now signed to Sony or whatever, and you kind of go, there's that myth of meritocracy in music. The majority of us have had to go through it the hard way, where you're working through everything and you're trying to figure out, what kind of music do I want to make, or what do I want to sound like? And you know, I get younger artists asking me like, what do you do like to get XYZ, or to get XYZ person to write about you? And it's like, have something to say, but don't rush to that point where you have the right thing to say. Try on different things. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's time, like it's never too late to figure out what you want to do. Like, I love that at the moment there's like older artists like Richard Dawson's a really great example of folk who didn't find their feet until well into their 30s, and now people absolutely adore everything they do. But go back in their back catalogue and check out stuff from back when. I mean, you know, that's an important thing your podcast is probably responsible for, is folk going back to music that's come out but not been discovered yet, and giving it more of an audience. Just because, you know, it's all fair and well to stick your album out and be like, right, I'm going to do a tour, but how many people are going to see an album on any given tour? If it's out there for long enough, you hope that it finds an audience. And, you know, you can think of any number of cult albums from like Spiderland or beyond for other examples where the band played it to nobody when it came out, but over time it's gradually found its audience. And that's not possible without folk building communities around the music and the albums. So no, I really appreciate that. Cheers.
What have you been working on recently? You did some pretty interesting events. I'm pretty sure I saw you at the fan zone for the football.
Yeah. It was really weird. Yeah, it's like the first gig in God knows how long, like well over a year, was me looking at all these picnic tables overlooking Glasgow Green, and the whole thing was socially distanced, and it was like the weather was middling, so maybe like a couple of hundred people like all spaced out over the Glasgow Green, but it's really fun to just be able to play. And like, I'm a guy who swears by touring. I used to just ride the rails, me and a guitar doing it, but nowadays it's like me and like 2 drummers and my wife on synth and keys and stuff. And it's cool to have another development's definitely going from guy with guitar out to like a full band, and that being a really big part of what I do, because my new album's all about grooves and getting people dancing and engaging with the issues. So for me, it's like, if I don't have that element, the message is almost not going to have the same amount of focus, and getting to do that live has been amazing. And yeah, it's been nice to be able to do the Fringe Festival and the Eurozone thing, and I got to go to Manchester and London and stuff. And while it's terrifying to go to England during the plague, you come back and you know, it's one of those things where it's like, what doesn't kill you? It's been nice, but I'm definitely ganting to get the record out, because so many people are asking about it and stuff, and it's like, I just want to give them a date, play that gig when it comes out, and then just keep touring. You know, I mean, I'm sure all 3 of us come from backgrounds where we're used to just getting the band in a smelly wee van and going up and down the country a billion times. It's just something I miss.
Absolutely itching for it. cannot wait. I've just, same as everyone, you're reluctant to make the plans because you don't want them to fall through, because you're also kind of scared of the disappointment of the plans falling through. So there's
100%.
There's a trepidation.
That's kind of what's putting me off a little bit, because a part of me is like, I want to do, because you have to look at every gig you play as this could potentially just go under as you drive to the venue. Like, we were going to London for this festival, and it was like, we could literally pull into the venue and they're like, oh man, it's cancelled, there was a COVID outbreak, and you've just got to accept that you're driving 10 hours back in the other direction having done nothing. And it's weird how you explain it to someone who doesn't play music and they're like, what's this big thing you're building towards? And I'm like, 10 hours of driving, umpteen hours of rehearsal for half an hour to 45 minutes on stage. But if you don't get that 45 minutes on stage, the whole thing's wasted. But I've kind of resigned myself to see if we go into lockdown again and I've got to go completely online with it as opposed to get to play gigs. You kind of have to accept it, don't you? And for me, being like someone who can sync up audio from my drummer in Edinburgh and me here, it's not as fun as playing a real gig, but it's a stopgap. But I appreciate that I'm not a band in the classic sense, whereas you're going to get bands who they just can't do that. For them, it's about playing old-fashioned gigs and they just can't do that. So I hope for everyone's sake that we can just kind of stick to this world opening up in the old-fashioned sense, and that we're all going to see our favourite bands and we're all like getting to play shows again. But that said, I mean, we were literally talking about attending a gig at the old venue block tonight, so it's not like what I'm saying is ridiculous in the grand scheme of things, eh?
No,
it's true.
So let's stay positive. Do you ever think you'd hear that coming out of my mouth?
I know. So, Kapil, we were speaking before this when you were trying to decide on an album, and you said you were finding it quite difficult because you stopped listening to guitar music because you started, your album is basically like taking a lot of influences from the Billboard 100, right? So what was the thinking behind spinning the whole guitar vibe, and how did that make it difficult to pick an album for this?
I think it was just like, it's interesting because this is a guitar album, the one I've chosen, but to me, it's a jumping off point to talk about these way bigger issues. Not issues, but these way bigger topics. I think for the first record, you can hear that I really like Richard Dawson. You can hear that I really like Bill Orcutt. You can hear that I'm really into like all those skin graft noise rock bands from the 90s. But I don't know what it was. I think I got overly saturated with it. And without naming too many names, I saw kind of like bands doing a worse version of that get really big. And the number of times I've seen a really talented
Idols. Sorry, did I just say Idols? I didn't mean to say Idols.
They weren't the exact band I was going to pick, but I have many, many, many problems with them with that. But anyway, the point is, we can all agree on that. Is just the fact that when you're seeing this gentrified nonsense be heralded as like the return or the continuation of guitar music, to be honest, for me, it's not even like, I haven't been in a band in such a long time, so it's not even a selfish, that should be me. It's more like the number of times I've watched a band play at like 6 people and gone, this band are really good. I wish this kind of music had some kind of zeitgeist where it was popular. But all of a sudden it was like, this really popular band who all coincidentally went to the same Fame Academy or whatever, they're playing a worse version of it but are much bigger, and it frustrates me purely from a promoter's point of view. But that made me go, I need a break from this world where the deck's stacked against everyone I like on everyone whose music I enjoy. My wife's really, really into like the whole like early 90s Kiss FM thing, and we were listening to a lot of music together, and like a couple of artists really jumped out at me, like Solange's album Seat at the Table, a lot of D'Angelo, a lot of Frank Ocean. And from there I was like, right, I'm a guitar player, how would I write music about this? Because I'm a clunky keys player at best. But that kind of challenges and limitation was kind of where the record came from. But it's amusing because the record's not purely like me listening to the Billboard 100 as much as me just kind of going, a lot of the weirder influences are still there. It's just they're more of an Easter egg for you if you can listen out for them, as opposed to what's running the show if you want. But yeah, I think listening to music that's way more about the production, because I used to listen to, a really good album that's recorded on a potato, but if the riffs are good, you don't care. Whereas for me, it's like, I'm going to embrace lush production, and maybe like all the beats are kind of samey 808 type things, but they sound amazing. That's kind of, you know what it's like when you're writing songs and you go, I've listened to the same thing a bazillion times, and you meet people where they have one kind of music that they love and they'll never stray from that. I'm almost jealous that they can always get something from it. For me, I'm like, this was my favourite album ever 3 years ago, and now I can't be bothered listening to it. And I just went to a couple of gigs and I just felt haggard. But it was in a horrible, like, oh man, I need a break from gigs. And this was in December 2019. Little did I know that everyone was going to get a break from gigs anyway. But yeah, it was interesting listening to music from a completely different perspective and letting it write, because the songs are still really focused and every song on the record has a really jaggy anecdote behind it. But it's cool letting different textures influence the way I'm putting tunes together, while predominantly, like, I didn't learn a new instrument between albums. I'm still mostly just playing the guitar, but it's cool to be able to pull it from a different direction. It's funny because this album's got way more in common with the kind of music I would have listened to loads when I was writing the first album, but it's got so much in common with the stuff I like now as well that it's totally influenced the new stuff as well. I needed to choose an album where I just couldn't run out of good things to say about it, because the way I look at it is, it's like when you're on stage, if you don't look like you're getting into what you're doing, no one else is going to be into it. And in the same kind of way, if I want to get people into this lost gem of an album, I need to be ready to be a good cheerleader for it. Because if I'm coming at it with, it's pretty good, stick it on when I'm ironing, like no one's gonna go home and listen to that. You need to sell it. And this isn't even like me, like Galaxy promoter brain coming in. It's more just, if I can't put a passionate case for it, I can't pick it. And it was funny because I realized how long your podcast has been going when Mark would say, we've done this album already with my first 10 ideas. So it's good that you've already covered so many albums, because they're probably less unsung than I thought by virtue of being covered for that reason. So it's good.
Can I just say, as we get into this, it's weird. You said this is a guitar album. This is a guitar album, but to me, this isn't a guitar album. I don't hear a guitar album when I hear this album, and that's not pejorative at all. It's just, it's strange. That's how it sits in your thinking.
A godlike 40-year-old, clear skin, clear hair, clear smile, dead style, designer beach clothes, a little bit of a punch.
So I get, like, we'll start at the bottom, right, and we should do a little bit of due diligence on the band Long Fin Killie. Do you want to take us through it? Or
Yeah, sure. Long Fin Killie were a band who were active from the early 90s until about 1998. They were signed to the now defunct record label Too Pure Records, which a lot of people mostly know for being where a lot of early PJ Harvey and McCluskey stuff came out.
Yep.
They were one of those bands where they were kind of a footnote when I feel like they should have been a headline, personally speaking. But my main connection with them, I suppose, is that their lead singer / guitar player / violin player / everything player, Luke Sutherland, he played a lot of different instruments on some of the earlier Mogwai recordings. It's a Scottish podcast. A lot of people are going to have heard Young Team, Come On, Die Young, etc. And whenever you've heard like violin in a lot of their recordings, it's been this guy, Luke Sutherland, playing that. He's toured with them. He's currently playing in a band called Rev Magnetic. For more context, I should say, is that he grew up as, like, him and his sister were adopted by, I think he's of African descent, but he was adopted by 2 white parents, and him and his sister were the only black people on the Isle of Orkney. And
I think it was in South Ronaldsay, to be more specific.
Yeah, and a lot of his writing and a lot of his lyrics kind of like contend with that. And I found a lot to get stuck into when you talk about being between different identities, growing up in a landscape where you don't exactly identify with it, but trying to be in guitar music. And yeah, there's a lot to talk about in terms of what makes this band great. And it's a funny one because with a lot of my favorite records, like, my favorite thing about any given album that I love is that it's hard to categorize. You could call it post-rock, but not in that Explosions in the Sky way. It's post-rock in that kind of Gastro del Sol, Talk, Rodan kind of way, but it also sounds like Shudder to Think in places. The hallmarks of the album are like really intricate drumming, loads of like really chimey, like amazing sounding guitars, violins, thumb piano, loads of different stuff that it sounds like Dirty Three one moment and then sort of think the next. And it's kind of like the first half of the album is quite meditative and then it gets really frantic. I was weirdly introduced to the album. I knew about Luke Sutherland's writing before I was aware of his music. I knew he played violin for Mogwai, etc. when I was a really big fan of them growing up, but I was on tour. I was like on tour or something abroad, and like my friend James played them for me, and I was like, who is this? And I assumed it was Polvo or some like Skin Graft Records band, and he was like, this is Long Fin Killie, they're a really good Scottish band, you should know about them. And I was like, oh, because there's so many bands that just predate them, like Stretch Heads and Dawson, that I'm a really big fan of. And it immediately ticked a lot of those boxes for me, because I was still at my like 90s guitar rock phase at this point, and I loved it. And the more I delved into them after this, the more the song was from this album. The first song I heard of theirs, it's called Flower Carrier. And it's one of the more upbeat indie rock numbers on the record. But then you put the record on and I'm like, oh wow, it's in the last half of the album when the first half of the album is all like 9-minute violin.
Yeah, it's definitely quite atypical to as regards their sound. I mean, I think, as you said, when you mentioned Stretch Heads and Dawson and stuff, and that's maybe slightly more on the aggressive side of things, but the period they were emerging here, I think their peers were more kind of Billy Mahoney, the English band, Ganger. Craig B from Ganger went on to form Aerogram, and Steve from Ganger I think started Biss, and obviously early Mogwai, that kind of stuff. As you say, I think the post-rock thing's worth talking about, because I mean I saw when the band were being discussed and interviewed, they were citing influences like Cocteau Twins and Slowdive. They were citing influences like Can, obviously Marquis Smith in The Fall, who plays a part in this, and one that kept coming up was A.R. Kane. Who I have to admit to be not particularly familiar with, although I've seen it repeatedly mentioned that it's a good touchstone. But, this kind of post-rock sounds much more typically American to me. As you say, what became post-rock, like the kind of big orchestral Mogwai explosions, or through to like neoclassical, like Godspeed. It's not that school of it. It's kind of coming from the sort of, it's on the periphery of like people that were in hardcore bands that wanted to do something really, really different as they got a little bit older and they slowed down a bit. So Rodan, people from that, like Karate, Unwound. Even like bands like Sea and Cake with their kind of weird indie pop thing.
Good,
and then there's also this whole ingredient in the much more subdued music that Long Fin Killie do that touches on people as like diverse as like La Bradford, Set Fire to Flames, who were almost experimental at points, almost textural rather than musical sometimes. Rachel's, Tarantel. There's a Tarantel record called For Carol Sagan that I think is quite a good reference, albeit it came after this. Tortoise, even with the kind of slightly jazzier moments.
Yeah, I was chatting to Stuart Braithwaite from Mogwai about Long Fin Killie not long ago, and he was saying that he first encountered them when they were opening for Tortoise. And he was like blown away by like, it was like at times they were almost doing the Tortoise thing better than the band themselves.
Yeah. Another one, as you mentioned, you said Slint, and I think Slint is a good reference point, although Slint's often maybe sometimes overused as a reference point for that style.
Yeah, totally.
But some of the offshoots of that, so like the Dave Pajo stuff that came afterwards, like Ariel M, Papa M, and then that other group that came from Slint, the Four Carnation.
I was about to say there's a tune of theirs called Moonbeams where it's just like a 9-minute really meditative like tremoloed guitar while stuff's going on in the background. You have to listen for it.
When she was 5 years old, there was cake and bright lights.
It reminded me a lot of this record as well. I forget which came first. I don't know if Four Carnation's like late 90s and this was
Four
like...
Carnation I think it's like 96, 97. That kind of key release that they have. I mean, and obviously in terms of before it, some of the stuff that kind of jumped out. One in particular, I think it's a band called Bark Psychosis. Do you know them?
Oh, it's the drummer from Talk Talk's band. I think after they split.
Yeah. And it's like much harsher. They've got I think it might just be an EP, not a record, but it's called Scum, and it came from 1992. So it's maybe a couple of years before this band came together, which has that jazzy, loose, arty feel and like incorporates a lot of like surprising instruments and things. Whereas not long prior to that, they also had much more of the aggressive, abrasive bits popping through. So I think, again, by certainly not sounding the same, they are analogous somewhat.
Yeah.
So that scene is like maybe a little bit of a kind of lost world for a lot of people that have come after it. Certainly, even for me, the age I was, it was just beyond my perception, and I wasn't for the city. So, you know, you miss out on a lot of that stuff not being from the city as well. But yeah, the post-rock thing is really interesting because they aren't post-rock in any kind of typical sort of populist sense of it. I mean, with regards to the details of the band themselves, I mean, that name, Long Fin Killie, which is a little bit weird, you know, it comes from a type of fish that survives outside the water for up to 2 or 3 weeks, thanks to a process I learned called diapause, which is similar, but not the same as quiescence. Tardigrades apparently do both, so there you go. It featured the core lineup. The lineup we're talking about in this case was Luke Sutherland, Colin Gregg, David Turner, and a guy called Philip Cameron. And I believe that stayed more or less the same, apart from Turner leaving around about 96. He was replaced in drums by Kenny McEwen. In fact, that might even have been 97. And then Kenny McEwen appeared on the last record of their 3, all named after, I believe, tragic figures.
That's right, aye.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of key points in their history, I'm not sure what you saw, Kapil, but I know they were bizarrely maybe on the Lollapalooza tour in 96. They were on the second stage of that, and, you know, advised, according to Luke in his interviews, to just play their straight ahead rock stuff and not be too weird. I know that in 96 they were involved in a serious bus crash.
Yeah, so a lot of Luke Sutherland's like early writing, I think, came out of like him reckoning with his injuries and recovery from that bus crash. Like his
exactly right, yeah.
His lung collapsed in or something like that, and he was
collapsed lung, broken ribs, broken collarbone, and other various injuries, I think. And is the first book called, is it Jelly Roll?
Jelly Roll, yeah.
Yeah. So that was written at that point. Now, after, just to give people, because we simply don't have the time to go into all the other projects that spun off from this, Luke Sutherland, after the band had started Bose, which was a duo, and it was generally seen as being a little bit more accessible. Also released on 2 Pure. As you say, he did 3 books: Jelly Roll, that's the one, 98, Sweet Meat in 2002, and then Venus is a Boy in 2004. You mentioned that he did a whole load of stuff, including violin for Mogwai, and that he's currently in the band Rev Magnetic. Colin Gregg from the band, he started a label in Stockholm. The band always seemed to be over in Sweden and Scandinavia quite regularly, from what I can tell. But his label's called Coco Hippo, and he currently records music as, I think, Wilma Cakebread. I think is his moniker. I think he was. I'm sure that Colin Gregg was also briefly in a sort of Scandinavian indie pop band called Granada that I remember from when I was quite young as well.
Recognize and footprints to trails that matter and spells until we know how to say.
And the only other one I could find anything in particular about was David Turner, who, you know, it's one of those Wikipedia entries where you're like, you kind of get the feeling that somebody maybe added it for a laugh, but he's recording he's recording as Disco Haircut Astronaut.
That's one of those things where you look at it and you go, that could be a troll as much as it could be
exactly. That's
true.
Why I wasn't going to get. I was like, no, we've definitely putting in some kind of disclaimer here. But yeah, I mean, they are one of those bands that there's not like exactly an abundance of lore about them. They were quite a sort of understated project. And they were at a time when obviously it was pre-internet, more or less.
Yeah.
And so there's not just loads and loads and loads of footage and photos, and
there's not like an abundance of camcorder or VHS footage of them online. There's like a live interview they did on telly.
Is that the one in the laundromat?
Yeah.
Oh, it's so fucking weird. It's so fucking weird.
It's a shame because you can get footage of bands from the 70s where they're like on TV or they're doing an interview. You could pick any kind of era of music, but there's this weird like 90s period where people just weren't recording things enough, and I can't find any footage of stuff. But the good news is that all of their records and some of their EP, all three of their full-length albums and all some of their EPs, all on Spotify. This record's not impossible to find. You can get it on Spotify quite easily, which is good news.
Yeah, most of the back cat is on YouTube as well, although I noticed there was some key omissions for their Spotify, and you know, it's always that thing when a record or an EP gets omitted from the Spotify collection, you're like, do they hate it? Is that why that's not there, or is it some kind of conflict with the label? So
I wonder that, because I know that the record that they put the most stuff out on, Two Pure's, no around anymore, but it's part of the Beggars group, and I don't know if there's like politics and stuff to do with that.
But yeah, the other stuff's on there. So I don't know. I mean, well, maybe what we should actually do is just have a very quick chat about the other records briefly. I mean, that first EP they brought out, Buttergut, 94 it was. I have to say, I'd never heard this before. I really thought it was really good.
Yeah.
Really loose and breezy. There's loads of like quiet, loud dynamics and the kind of tradition of some of that like Slint and Mogwai early stuff. There's bits of piano, I think I heard in there, and quite a lot of exuberance. Like, it sounds like they're having quite a fun time. The second track, Natsuki, had a real krautrock feel to it. I actually thought I found that a very likeable record, and that is one of the ones that's not on Spotify. As to whether that's because they just think it was too early and too naive or something, they didn't want to reproduce it, but it's a shame. It stands up, actually.
I actually like, I don't know if I'm biased again, because this is the album I love the most, because I think it showcases like different areas of what they're good at, because the album directly after this, it's a lot rockier, it's a lot more like 3-minute bangers kind of thing, and I imagine
Valentino?
Yeah,
96 Valentino, yeah.
And I don't know, I kind of listened to that and go, I reckon too many people told them that the more meditative stuff was boring and they got put off a little bit. But I think they went a bit more rock towards the end of between that midpoint and towards the end of their career. Mm-hmm. Again, it would be amazing to be able to see some live footage to see what that would have looked like. But what can you do?
Yeah, the Valentino one is interesting, as you say. It's got, there's tracks on it. There's a track called Kitten Heels, which I think is the third one, that's like just a really direct, kind of angular rock song. But then the title track, Valentino, is this really careful, understated builder, which it actually really reminds me of some of the early shipping news stuff from the EPs. Yeah. They make a thing of putting in really innovative and interesting, unusual percussion. Reading about it, the second one was considered slightly tonally darker than the first one. You know, even though it's maybe slightly louder and faster overall, it seemed to deal with some pretty kind of murky themes. I saw Luke saying that it was a little bit more focused on the sexism side of things and a bit less on the racism. There's phrases in it like allergic to lipstick, which was sort of metaphor for that. I think the 1,000 Wounded Astronauts tracks are reference to football fans and Machismo. I think astronauts was a sort of stand-in for space cadets.
Yeah.
And for anyone that's really interested in kind of scouting through their catalogue, there's a version of this that was released in the States with an extra track called Fresher. And I also noticed that on the Hands and Lips EP, which was a track taken off this 4-track release, there's a tune called Clinch that I actually thought was really nice. It's just, I think it's like one of what might be called a B-side on this little EP, but it's worth finding online. And as you say, then there was is it Amelia?
Yeah, it's like after that pilot who disappeared, Amelia Earhart.
Yeah, exactly. Who coincidentally we talked about in the podcast, I think in the Nexus last week or the week before.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
That was considered a much more accessible album, so you see people talking about it as being the way they got into the band and they work backwards. And then they finished with a thing called the Lipstick EP in 97, which has some really interesting drumming on it. Like, it basically gets almost drum and bass at points.
Yeah, 100%.
Like, really skillfully done.
It's so tragic that I kind of feel like, I mean, again, like, because they were a wee bit before I was even going to gigs to any extent, like I wouldn't have got to see them anyway, being a bit young, but it would have been amazing to see that kind of stuff live, because everything feels very acoustic, like it doesn't feel sampled or anything to get that energy out
Absolutely.
of it. It feels like, yeah. And you can kind of even hear it on Houdini, because it's one of those albums where I don't think of it like, I love this song. I know Flower Carrier because it's the song that got me into the band, but I think of it as a journey from start to finish. For this, I really want an album where it's a journey where you always want to listen to the thing in one sitting. You don't want to go, oh, I'm going to skip the middle third of the album and then go to the end. It's an album that I'm really into all the way through.
And let's be honest, like those original post-rock records were all kind of like that. That was the luxury of the format, wasn't it? That you could kind of embark on voyages with them instead of just banging a bunch of tunes back to back.
Yeah,
I think the first post-rock record I really remember being much more like a succession of good tunes was probably Mr. Beast.
Yeah,
that we spoke about that in the show, about how it seemed almost like a pop post-rock album because it was a load of tunes that all felt quite different, yet they were all great, but you know, it didn't have that same through line that a lot of other post-rock had. The Lipstick EP is... It crosses into art pop. I think as towards the end of their career, there was something a lot more British sounding about them. As I said,
I was going to say, towards the end, they almost reminded me as much of like Roxy Music as they did of like American bands like Shippin' News or Silkworm or Juno 44 or whoever. It looked like they were listening to different things. I'm a big fan of that, actually, because see, when bands, you're like, oh, you're really into these three influences, huh? And they're just kind of filtering them in different amounts across the records.
Yeah.
They were definitely a band where you could get a sense of, oh, they're changing up what they're listening as much as what they're doing. And I find that really fascinating.
No, agreed. Mark, what were your thoughts before we go into Houdini in any detail, man? I mean, I'm guessing you were totally new to these guys, because I mean, I was basically as good as new to these guys. So
yeah, I've never heard of them before. Never heard them before as a result, obviously. I knew of Luke because I used to practice in the same studio as Red Magnetic. So yeah, that's the only brush I'd ever had with Luke Sutherland himself. This band are really interested from me. I did get a lot of post-rock vibes from the first record, the one we're covering, Houdini. So it actually reminded me a lot of Godspeed and Do Makes You Think, just in the terms of the approach to the kind of melodic sensibilities of it. Obviously used quite a lot of different instruments, bouzouki, mandolin, violin quite prominently. It was a good experience for me listening to these guys. They certainly liked to go in different directions. All three records are so different that they seem quite unsettled as to what kind of band they wanted to be. I think there's certain bands that can move from record to record and change up genre and it feels effortless. To me, this feels a little bit restless, and that's fine. It's got its own charm, but of the lot, I think I preferred this one the most.
Yeah, I have to say, as much as I do agree with Kapil that it's good that they kind of expanded their horizons and transitioned to something later on, the overt Britishness of the later stuff I find really alienating. I mean, it just doesn't really work for me. It crosses into that art pop thing. I can't really explain it. There's some a little bit twee about it that doesn't.
There's a reason I chose this one and not the last one, and it's not for dissimilar reasons to the one that you're giving me, because I feel like there's definitely a sense of I'm a disembodied kind of character to the later stuff where Luke's obviously he's putting on, not putting on a bit, that would be cheapening it a little bit, but I feel like with this album it feels very much like it's him doing him, and I really like that, and I feel like that's the personality I enjoy in his other work, whereas the character of like overt Britishness and the kind of Jarvis Cocker energy of the later stuff isn't for me either, really. Yeah.
To sort of date this and contextualise it, as I said, there's not a lot of like digital content, but you can find scans of old magazines, you know, the likes of Select and all these like defunct old places like Melody Maker and Vox and stuff. They've got scanned archives on. I found a copy of Select where this album was reviewed, and it's reviewed on literally the same page as Juno 44 and La Bradford. So like, it was quite fitting, albeit I thought, interestingly, some people would probably disagree. I think this is this band's peak, whereas Juno 44 and La Bradford didn't peak until the subsequent albums were the two that were reviewed. So that was kind of interesting that they continued to plough this furrow and maybe refined it a bit more, whereas I think Long Fin Killie sort of moved on and started to develop it quite early.
Have you ever heard the Juno 44 in the Fish Tank session? It's real good.
Yeah, really good. I mean, a lot of those sessions are really, really good. The 33 Low ones.
I was about to say, their Neil Young cover is one of my favourite covers.
Down by the River. Absolutely beautiful, isn't it? I have to say, if I'm being totally honest, at first listen, I thought, this record's really wishy-washy. I'm going to really struggle to stay interested in this.
Yeah.
But it's grown on me. the more I've listened to it. And it's not that I don't have an ear for that kind of stuff, I do, but now that I think back in it, it probably took me quite a while to develop the ear for the things like early shipping news and stuff anyway. So I think being with it for a bit longer has forced me to sort of like familiarise myself with some of the nuance a little bit.
Sometimes it depends on the way you first hear a record as to whether you're going to get into overall.
It is just not an immediate album, so anybody listening to the show who's going to investigate it, I can only say that unless you're really, really into the style of music already, it's very unlikely you'll get the best from it at first listen. That was something that Dave levelled at me when we were doing Talk Talk, but I've tried with Talk Talk. I can't enjoy Talk Talk.
I listened to that episode. It's funny because I know that you struggle with the guy's voice a bit. You found it.
I do, but I also just struggle with the band in general. It just is not something that emotionally connects with me. I just want them to shut up.
Did you find it quite sparse as well? The big complaint I get is nothing happens for ages, and then something kind of happens, and then it ends. That's the big complaint I've always got.
Well, given that we're in danger of like confusing people as to whether we're talking about Talk Talk or Long Fin Killie here. No, Talk Talk I just find dreary as fuck, and I like music when nothing happens for a very long time, right? But they just don't push my buttons. Whereas this is a twist on that theme, and I do see the parallels, except I find this a lot more engaging.
Yep.
Now, that is not to say I find this hugely stimulating throughout, because there are definitely moments in this where I would happily have seen 15 minutes cut out of this record, and it would probably have been given more spins as a result of like maybe greater brevity, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I think, you know, the indulgence of some of it is fine, but there's certain tracks that aren't adding anything to it. I think they repeat a lot of ideas that have already happened, and even though they're fine in their own right, it's like they don't necessarily need to be there, and I think the other tracks would have been better off without that. But then again, it is post-rock, it's the early 90s, that was happening all over the shop, and they're a young band, so I can't really expect them to make those sort of very disciplined, tough decisions to chop out.
When I started listening to way more R&B and pop, I noticed that cutting and trimming the fat was a big part of it, and I love a really good half an hour long record where nothing overstays its welcome. And when I recommended this, I thought this really is the antithesis of a lot of considerations I have if I put a record together, but the context of it's really important, and I really like sticking it on and then not focusing on it as such, but like, you know, you wouldn't draw the curtains and just focus on this music. You'd almost need something else. And again, I keep banging this drum, but I feel like if I was live, a wee bit steaming and watching this, I'd be having the best time. But there's something very like live. It would be so meditative, but
I think it would be edgier live. It would gain that little bit of volume and power that might take what seemed like quite mild songs and make you realise that there was kind of like a much darker edge to them. Sometimes production you can kind of lose that just by virtue of it being quieter. You know, I think if we just have a wee look at the tunes themselves, I mean, A Man Ray, I think, is a remarkably sophisticated track for such a young group. I love that the brass swells in it. I think that's a really, really great touch.
It reminds me of, like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with that scene from Atlanta in the later 90s, like the Cabbage Town bands.
Maybe if you throw some names, but it's not ringing a bell.
Smoke is the big one that I really like, but the guy who made the documentary for Smoke, he made the Fugazi documentary Instrument, and there's like a tie-in between that and that DC scene, but there was a lot of brass, but it was very lo-fi, and the way it was recorded, it was this almost like Elephant Six before Elephant Six thing. But it's a tangent that doesn't mean much if you don't know the scene, but it reminds me of loads of different things that I knew I already liked, and the brass is a big part of that. But yeah, I absolutely love that on that song.
Well, Mark, when you said about Do Makes You Think, I can see the parallel there.
Yeah, I mean, it's got a kind of dark, jazzy feel, backroom, end of the night vibe, and the basses get this really sinister groove, which I quite dig as well. I'm not too sure about the lyrics, I'm not too sure about his vocal in general. The sort of breathy thing he does is not really a vibe that I enjoy on the whole, but I do like this song. I think it's a good song.
The follow-up, How I Blew It with Houdini, is a slightly lighter touch, you know, a bit more playful, lots of improvised percussive noises in it, which I think they do quite a lot. Seems like they're playing bottles and bits and bobs of like railings and stuff like that. I don't know what they were using in the room, but that's quite nice.
She said I'll take you to the cinema and show you where it's at, boy.
I think his voice is, I can understand how it's, you know, a give or take thing, but I think it's better judged than the second track. It fits quite smoothly into it. The violin in the second track's great. Yeah, I mean, I don't fall out with your criticism. I don't know that I would take too much of it, but compared to the likes of Talk, I far prefer his delivery.
Well, I do prefer his delivery on this song, to be fair. I prefer the narrative to the lyrics as well. And I like how loose this feels. It feels more jammy, if that makes sense.
Homo Erectus, some really clever guitar breaks in that one. It's quite innovative, and there's a really, really good beat that arrives about in a minute 45. There's some really innovative drum beats in this band that is certainly consistent across their catalogue. Somehow, I mean, the beat is fast. It's really quite a rapid thing, yet the song still manages to sound languid. It's maybe partly because there's some really kind of ketamine horns that seem to sort of drag it back. So even though the BPM and the noises are regular, you never really feel like it's racing. That's quite interesting. Then you've got the big one, Heads of Dead Surfers.
Oh yeah, the Marquis Smith cameo.
Yeah, so this was like their breakthrough track on radio as well, wasn't it?
Yep.
I mean, for obvious reasons, because, you know, Fall fans are obsessive. See, taking Marquis Smith out of the equation entirely in that tune, it's a good tune. I wasn't sure when he was going to arrive in it, so I was listening to it going, this doesn't need Marquis Smith to be a really strong song. There's the way the violin's played in it really reminds me of the guy Owen Pallett.
Final Fantasy, etc.
Yep. I think there's like a really very heavily produced, or rather maybe it'll be the opposite, a completely underproduced transistor sounding guitar on the left speaker. That's a really bold creative decision. And yeah, the big Marquis Smith ending. But did you notice, by the way, see that big Marquis Smith ending where Luke's sort of singing underneath it? It just sounds like Block Party.
Yeah,
I would say it sounds better, but I know what you mean.
But I mean genuinely, but it's like seriously really, really stylistically similar.
It's not. It's not a ridiculous comparison to make. The last line of that song about the A&R man's hilarious. I don't know why. I almost laugh when you go, "What would the Marquis Smith voice sound like over this?" And it almost sounds like someone doing a parody of Marquis Smith, which is how Marquis Smith sounds.
Marquis Smith is a parody of Marquis Smith. That's exactly what he was. Like, I think he had like one earnest tune, and then after that, he was just a guy playing Marquis Smith.
I quite like the hook in this song, by the way. I think it's got a really good hook, the vocal hook. And it's got a really mental guitar solo, which I love. I think, I don't know, is that... See, there's 3 guitar parts at the end, and one of them is really badly, or really underproduced or overproduced or whatever. I don't know if... And the guitar solo is playing over it, and it's really, really cool.
We're never going to get to the bottom of whether this is underproduction or overproduction. We maybe have to give them the benefit of the doubt.
What do you think?
I feel like it's one of these weird ones where I feel like now that I've talked about him enough, I'm going to bump into him at some point, and this question's just going to be in my head the whole time. And he'll be like, I'm not telling you, I'm not telling anyone.
Montgomery, the fifth track, just a lush little interlude. I think it's actually really well sequenced though, because you do come off the back of that Marky Smith thing. You need a little bit of a palate cleanser, even just to rinse out the people that were just excited because Marky Smith's on it. You know, Marky Smith was on loads of Fall records and half of them were shit.
Yeah, 100%.
So track 6, Love Smothers Allergy.
Looking for the perfect match, I found myself bumbling in a backseat with some effeminate anarcho-rocker until I found I was allergic to his lipstick.
Another one with some really fucking unusual guitar tones in here. I was trying to describe it to myself, and I wrote, sounds it was recorded down a fag packet attached to a torn newspaper sitting in a biscuit tin. And I don't really know how you articulate that to a sound engineer, so I'm going to assume that they were just fucking about with ideas and just were like, that sounds good, just go with it. Another cool beat as well, although for me the vocals in this one stray far too fucking close to Morrissey for comfort.
Again, I guess that must have been an influence as well. There's kind of a yodely kind of quality to bits of the vocals across all the records where you could make that comparison for sure.
Yeah, the weird arty vibrato thing.
Yeah.
So there's a third guitar that plays over towards the end, and it's got like little bits of ambience around like the edges of the sound, delays and reverbs and all that. It's really nice. It kind of feels like it's floating in the background, and it just hypnotically plays out. That's one thing I liked about this record. It's quite hypnotic.
That's something I feel like if I had to pick a reason why I don't really like post or math rock, or the compilation of the two nowadays, as you would see at like Arctangent or whatever, is that everything becomes about recycling a hook and making sure the delay is really tight and really like at you in a kind of like almost U2 Stadium kind of way. Whereas in this, it's very sprawling. It's like add an atmosphere to it, and I kind of it sounds really baby boomerish to be like, I miss when music did that, but you know what I mean. It's like I miss that energy in the fact that it's adding a new texture to something that you're already listening to, and that delay on that guitar is a great example of that.
Yeah.
Kapil, you mentioned Hollywood Gem earlier on. That is that fucking laundromat interview. And by the way, what the fuck was going on with interviews in the 1990s when there was this period of like The Word and all those kind of shows where they were trying to get the edgiest, weirdest interviews. We talked about it, Mark, when we interviewed Katie Jane Garside, and she did that absolutely bizarre fucking interview
with Paul Morley.
What the fuck were people smoking in the 1990s when they were planning these? It's like, it doesn't even seem like an interview. Everybody seems really confused. Is there a question? Is that an answer? It's just a bunch of randomly cut sentences.
There's a lot of like 100 episodes of like, I think it's like 120 minutes where the whole point is that it doesn't make any sense. But that's almost like, I don't want to listen to that though. I don't learn anything about the artist. It kind of defeats the point of the interview a little bit. But
it's like a fascinating insight though into this like no man's land of time when journalists were really struggling to adapt or find their voice.
Yeah.
It's so weird. The song's fine. I don't particularly like that song. There was a video to go along with it. I think it's okay. It doesn't really set my world on fire. Lambert and Lamplighter, the 8th track. Some really good lyrics in that one. I think it's actually the musical structure in that song seems quite light-hearted, almost like a wee lullaby, like a rock lullaby thing.
Yeah, I like the structure of it because it does feel almost pop rocky in places. You know, it's in a major key, I think.
Yeah.
You know, and it's got a lot of levity and humour, which is missing from the album so far. I think at this, and well, this kind of it, I think there's irony throughout, you know, but this is like more obviously on the nose, which really helps, I think, at this point in the record.
Korngold, number 9.
And that's not all.
I love the nice sparky start. I think that's really well judged. It needed it. The album is a little bit drowsy at this point, and that gives it a wee slap. I think that's good. All those kind of interwoven strings, whether it's the violin or the guitars themselves, makes this really nice tapestry. And the vocals are used very sparingly in that one. I think it works really well as a textural number.
Yeah, I agree. It's got it feels medieval to me. I don't know why. I think it's because of the bouzouki or the mandolin or whatever alongside the violin. It's an interesting song. I like it, and I like his vocal on it as well.
So, Mark, with the next one as well, we might need a new alarm because Idiot Hormone has that very 90s early mathy clean bass sound of Don Caballero.
I was going to say it reminded me of like Farrakhan and all those kind of bands as well, where it's like that kind of almost proto Bob. No, I would say, is it Bob Weston's fault?
No, I think he's sharper sounding. There's something very, I don't know. He had a lot of like top end and sizzle in his bass. It's not even got that. It's got this kind of slightly distorted mathiness to it.
Yeah,
like math before people started like saturating it like crazy.
Yeah.
Although I don't know what we'd use for a Don Cab alarm. I'm not quite sure. Like just like a flurry of notes.
Yeah.
It's Damon Shea swearing at.
Oh, that bit from American Don where he goes, "Rah!"
Yeah. Do you know what? We tangent. I my wife had never seen High Fidelity, and like I showed it to her, you know, the Jack Black film, and the guy from Don Cab makes a cameo in it as some record store weirdo. Yeah, and the singer from US Maple's also in it, and I'm like, why are these cameos here? It's so random.
US Maple one is that's a brilliant cameo. I didn't know that either. Idiot Hormone's quite a racially charged song, really driving staccato violin in it, contrasts really nicely with that bass stuff, and there's a brilliant jump at about 1 minute 20 where it really all kind of bursts into life. I think it makes it probably one of the album highlights.
Yep.
Albeit it's got a pretty fucking whack guitar sound slightly later on. it's a strange choice, but it's a really, really strong number in the context of the album, I think.
There's a lot of texture in this song, which I like. The drumming, I think there's a lot of great drumming on this record, but it's perhaps at its best in that. It's perhaps the best drumming in this song. And again, the bouzouki or mandolin, whatever it is, the other stringed instrument that's not a guitar. It could be either or, because he seems to play both. It really works in this. I love the way that they bring in different textures and they're thinking about that. It's so young, so early in their career, and in the development of this kind of music as well.
Rocket Head on Mandatory Surveillance. This is one of the songs that I felt, whilst I don't hate the song by any means, it feels a little bit unnecessary because it is quite a long record at this point already.
Yep.
It's a really unusual percussive sound in it, which I actually quite liked. I wasn't sure if it was the way they'd mic'd it or just what they'd used. It's something quite unorthodox. I think the music's got a much simpler theme that just sort of spreads out slowly into a kind of layer of 90s art rock, but it just didn't really bring much else to the table. Except it kind of fatigues you just slightly. As with the song we've mentioned a lot, you then get to Flower Carrier, which is
what a song.
Such a big tune that I would have rather have got there sooner, if you know what I mean.
I kind of agree, and there's versions of like tunes on the album where I go, oh, I've heard this idea kind of done to conclusion, ironically, like later in the album or early in the album. And I think you're right about the song Before Flower Carrier for that reason. And if you've already heard the album, you know, I know Flower Carrier's next, I kind of want to be there already kind of thing. I know what you mean.
Yeah. So yeah, Flower Carrier, that total slappy bass attack, flurry of really great aggressive drum rolls. bursts of really arty, fuzzy guitar, settles into a brilliant groove at 1 minute 40. It is definitely another highlight as well.
It feels Fugazi-esque to me almost.
It does at points, I didn't want to use that in case everybody rolled their eyes, but yeah, there's definitely...
Well, I said it, so you're fine. It's almost catchy, right? Which is cool. And there's definitely, whatever it is, the bouzouki, the mandolin, whatever it is, it's going for a distortion pedal on this song, and that's fucking cool.
Well, see, this is that point in the album where when some of the other tracks can definitely be more, can be compared to stuff like Tortoise and La Bradford and stuff like that. This one is much more of the Rodin unwound karate kind of ilk, that much more post-hardcore, post-rock, if you know what I mean. And then a fucking monster final tune, Unconscious Gangs of Men. Another big mathy, jazzy one, quite erratic, loads of ideas in it. And it's actually, it's certainly the version I was listening to, it finishes and then it re-emerges into this big sort of bell-like, shoegazy, lush melodrama outro. So the whole thing clocks in just under 14 minutes. It's a big ask for an ending to an album that's already quite subtle and takes a fair bit of digestion. As I said, can't really bitch about it too much because this was a young group trying out things in an era when this was sort of the norm. It tired me out a lot. I don't think I really gave it the attention it probably deserved, this final tune. It was fine, but I'd heard much better prior. And I would rather have gone back and listen to them again, I think.
It definitely appreciates on repeated listens. Like when you get used to that being at the end of the album, you go from it being kind of annoying. Do you know the trajectory of it reminds me of when I heard that song Atlas by Battles for the first time. I hated that song the first time I heard it, but then I kept coming back to it, and over time I just got weirdly obsessed with it. It reminds me of this song actually, because you realise how much is going on, and I think the age of the band's a really good thing to call out, just because they're not a wee guy band, but they're definitely like not a mature, we've been at this a long time, we know what we're doing kind of thing. And you have to like salute the ambition almost, because they're trying stuff, and to me I notice new layers every time I listen to it, but it's a big ask on an album that's already clocking in well almost into an hour. It's like an hour, just over an hour, the whole album, so it's quite...
Yeah, you know what, that track's quite analogous for me with the track Third Eye at the end of Anima by Tool, which is another like 13-minute marathon thing, absolutely jammed full of ideas, some of which work brilliantly and some of which are just a bit laborious. But again, as you say, one that appreciates on further listens. I have to say, I wasn't sure if I was going to be on message with this after the first couple of times listening, but it's definitely grown on me, and I think the more I read up on the band and the more I kind of placed them chronologically, because the other thing I was concerned was this band's just sort of like appropriating a sound that was being done and just sort of bringing it over to a market that maybe is a little bit unaware of it, and kind of doing that crass thing where, you know, before the internet there were certain movements that took a while to bleed over, and a lot of bands kind of got there early enough that they were able to take that sound and pass it off in their own market as their own. There's definitely some post-rock bands that have gotten away with that, but looking at the timeline with Long Fin Killie, as I said, the likes of Juno 44 and La Bradford, they didn't peak until the year after, and they were on the edge of this movement. And so I don't want to I don't want to undermine them by suggesting for a minute that they weren't really innovating, because they were. So yeah, it's grown on me. My respect for the band's grown quite a bit, as my knowledge of them has grown, and so for me it's a yeah. I'd like to see us go in.
Yeah, I'm going to sit on the fence. I don't know. I'm not steeped in the genre enough to really confidently hold an opinion on this that I think would be of any use, I suppose. I like the album enough. I think that there's probably other post-rock stuff around this era which deserves to be in it, in this discography, more than this. But that is not saying this is a bad album. So I'm going to sit on the fence. Sorry, guys.
It was a big ask. There were no fart sounds in this album. We thought you were going to hate it.
Oh, well, you know.
What album had fart sounds on it?
Descendants.
Descendants, yeah.
Nice.
So, Kapil, I guess you're going to put it in, right?
obviously. But I guess
that'd be the biggest heel turn in the history of heel turns.
It would.
Like, plot twist, I hated the album the whole time. I don't know, it's a funny one because I think Luke, for me, his body of work's really resonant. I discovered the album in a naturally organic way, and a lot has to be said for how you come across an album. And for me, it was like, oh, I like that song the minute I get home from tour, because I heard that 3 days into like a 2-week tour, and I was thinking about that album the whole time. I could have just put it on Spotify, but just didn't get around to it because, you know, when you're traveling, you don't sit down for an hour and a half and listen to one band kind of thing.
Yeah, totally.
But the minute I got home, it was like, oh, what was that band? Long Fin Killie. I'm going to go and listen to them. And then delved into all of like Luke's other work. And I don't know, it's a weird one where musically it ticks a lot of boxes, but narratively there's just a lot for me in there. And it's nice, I think, grappling with, because I think my own music, I write from out with the perspective of my immediate identity. It kind of typifies a lot of what I do, but actually getting really personal with what he's writing about and going, yeah, this really speaks to me. And I'm not going to lie, right? A lot of post-rock's about a whole lot of nothing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You know, when a great band have a song called I'm Jim Morrison, I'm Dead, you're not going to expect much of the narrative in that song, are you? But when a band in a genre that's not got much to say have a lot to say, it's really refreshing. I appreciate, even on paper, it's a big ask, and that I've got to be in the mood to listen to this album, but I'd stick it in on that basis alone.
Smashing, man. It's a good shout. You know what else you're going to have to do as well? You're now going to have to do the Nexus.
A complicated series of connections between different things.
Oh, I'm going to have so much to say about how much I love the album and then let everybody down at the point of the Nexus, but I'm all right. I've got it.
So this week's Nexus was drawn behind closed doors. And actually, funnily enough, we already mentioned Katie Jane Garside for that Paul Morley interview. Well, Katie Jane, when we interviewed her, she nominated Aeneas Nin. Now, I believe this is actually the second time that Aeneas Nin's come out the hat. I think Aeneas Nin was sometime in year one. I think that was one of her nexi as well. But as I say, Katie Jane Garside of Queen Adrena and Daisy Chainsaw and various other things has nominated Aeneas Nin. So Kapil is going to have the first shot at linking Long Fin Killie to Aeneas Nin.
I'm not padding or stalling for time, but I didn't know who Aeneas Nin was, if I'm being frank. So for the listeners who might not know, do you want to give people an idea of who she was?
Famous writer, famous feminist figure, very sex positive.
Fan of erotica.
Sex positive is how we'll phrase it. Yeah. And an inspiration to many, both literary and otherwise, which I'm sure will come up.
Cool. So Long Fin, I'm starting with Long Fin Killie and ending up at Aeneas Nin.
That is correct.
Yes. Long Fin Killie, fronted by a man called Luke Sutherland, who's also a writer. He has a novella called Venus as a Boy, named for a song by Björk, and she in turn named that song for the Roman goddess of love, Venus as a Boy. And the title of an Aeneas Nin book from 1977, a collection of erotica she'd written, was called Delta of Venus, using the same goddess of love. So there's my Nexus.
That is a tight Nexus. Yeah, that is some tidy stuff. Mark, that's the second week in a row that the guests have humiliated you.
I wouldn't say humiliated. I think they got the memo. Most importantly,
good spec.
Kapil, I could actually shorten that even further for you, because Venus as a Boy is named after the Björk song, and Björk recommended Aeneas Nin's diaries in a big book special thing that was done by a magazine a few years ago.
Oh well, there you go.
There you go. But as you guessed, we do have the same kicking off point. So, Mark, will I go next?
Yeah, go for it.
Long Fin Killie, Luke Sutherland for Long Fin Killie, wrote the book Venus as a Boy novella in 2004. That book was published on Bloomsbury.
I tried to do this and I couldn't get there because I just abandoned it for something else. So please finish.
So in 2014, Bloomsbury republished a book called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by a writer called Jules Verne, who it's up for debate, but may or may not be the father of sci-fi. That book's certainly seen as being one of the first examples of the genre. Jules Verne also wrote Journey to the Centre of the Earth and Around the World in 80 Days. In 1957, the Oscar for the best soundtrack went to Victor Young for his work on the film adaptation Around the World in 80 Days. That same year, there was a very famous soundtrack that was adjudged to be not eligible for Oscar consideration. That caused a bit of furore at the time. So basically, this soundtrack was prohibited from entering that category by the Academy on the basis that its writers, who were a couple called Baby and Louis Barron, were not members of the Musicians' Union. Now, the film in question was Forbidden Planet, and the soundtrack was totally groundbreaking. The reaction of the Academy, the reaction of the Musicians' Union put a lot of noses out of joint, the fact that this was reclassified to make it ineligible. Even the release itself had to have the terminology changed from electronic music by to simply electronic tonalities by to avoid getting into further trouble. So Baby and Louis Barron are particularly important figures because they are credited as being the first ever artists to commit electronic music to magnetic tape via, at the time, the way they produced it using that medium was laborious kind of hand-cut edits. The first ever song they did in that fashion, I think it was in 1950, was called Heavenly Menagerie. They were a married couple, by the way, which also I think is a charming little detail. In 1948, a book by a famous mathematician with a brilliant name, Norbert Wiener. And the book name is fucking really long, but it's basically cybernetics. Baby and Louis used that to build circuits, and in particularly they built and then utilised a ring modulator, a very, very early ring modulator, to perform the soundtrack to Forbidden Planet. And the thing is, because of the way it worked, because it worked by overloading the circuits in a very unpredictable way, and there were so many like microscopic fluctuations that would change the feedback loop, they couldn't actually replicate individual sounds. So when they were recording it, they had to try and get everything and just try and get a closest approximation of what they were going for. It was a very imprecise art, and there's something beautiful about that, I think. So anyway, in 1952, that couple, Baby and Louis, they also scored a film by a guy called Hugh Parker Guiler called Bells of Atlantis. And apart from being Anais Nin's husband, her first husband, Guiler, Anais Nin was actually in that film. So there you go.
Nice. Alright, so my turn. So Luke Sutherland, he played with Mogwai for a wee bit, as we've already discussed. I think the second soundtrack they did, could be wrong here, but the second soundtrack that they did was for The Fountain, the Darren Aronofsky film.
I think that's right, yeah.
The cinematographer on that film is a chap called Matthew Libatique, who he's worked with quite a few times on quite a few different films, actually. This guy's also worked quite extensively with Spike Lee, including on the film Inside Man. The main character of that film was, of course, played by Clive Owen. And Clive Owen appeared in a TV film about Hemingway and Gellhorn called Hemingway and Gellhorn alongside Nicole Kidman. And in 1980, Philip Kaufman directed an adaptation of the Anais Nin book Henry and June, and was actually one of the first ever films to receive the NC-17 rating in America, and is actually one of only 3 to ever have been nominated for an Oscar, which it was nominated for Best Cinematography. The NC-17 rating was made to replace the X rating that was above the R rating, and one of the first films to have that rating and one of the first films to be nominated for that, and it's based on her book. So yeah,
as I said, sex positive.
Yep.
Well, guys, that was fabulous. Thank you very much. Understated, obtuse, but fabulous.
Is that just you describe yourself there, Chris?
I would like to think so. Kapil, what a guy. Lovely to see you. Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show. Really appreciate it.
Some patter as well, man. Love it when you get in your flow.
Before you leave us, Kapil, have you got anything you want to plug? Anything you want to tell the loving public about?
Yeah, I have just finished a little run of shows, but fret not. The new record, Lal, concept album about Bollywood's out in February or March of the new year. I will, if you follow me at The Desi Futurist on Twitter or Instagram, or my name, on Instagram. You'll be able to find me there, and I'll be talking about not just what's coming up gig-wise and music-wise, but also the messages behind my work and the greater context therein. So if you're interested, do give me a shout on there. And yeah, new records out in the new year. Going to be touring it. Shows in Glasgow, Edinburgh and beyond. So another new single called Rupture of the Wheel, which will happen ahead of that, which I will be giving more information on my social media about. So yeah, thanks again for having me on the show. Absolute pleasure. It's been amazing to talk about an album that means so much to me personally, and best of luck to you.
Thanks, man.
Mark, we'll be back next week. I believe we are being rejoined by Anna.
Anna's coming back.
Anna Goldthorpe, back in town. Anna has nominated, for the purposes of that show, Shannon and the Clams and their 2013 album Dreams in the Rat House. And
Nexus.
The Nexus for that shall be...
This is so tense.
Now, this is interesting.
Okay.
The Nexus for that shall be Jean-Claude Darcheville, and that's as chosen by Anna's husband.
What are the chances?
Lewis Holleran. Lewis, you made a noose for your own neck there, pal, because you've just generated all that work for Anna, and like, who the fuck is Jean-Claude Darcheville, Lewis? What you giving me that shit for? Kapil, look after yourself. Mark, look after yourself.
Chris,
see everybody else next week. Go and do the survey if you're a subscriber, and if you're not a subscriber, how do you fucking sleep at night? Bye.
Bye.
See you later.